kind of evocation of the dense thicket of particulars that feed, I think, feed a robust sense of resistance. Okay. And then the second, and probably one of the most famous things that he ever said, is that he directs us to look at the insurrection of subjugated knowledges. And he distinguishes two different kinds of what he called historical knowledge of struggles. And one of those is a kind of lost scholarship. Those historical blocks of knowledge that are present but disguised, hard to recover, erudite knowledge, as he calls them, that can be revealed or brought back into the light by a kind of alternative science. And the example I want to give is an interesting text written in the 30s and 40s by two women in Hawaii called Sides of the Walker. I'll get to the example in a minute. So that's the first one, the idea of alternative sciences available but under-articulated by hegemonic understandings of knowledge. And then the second one he talks about naive knowledges located low down on the hierarchy beneath the required level of cognition. Low-ranking knowledges, unqualified or disqualified knowledges. Those are all quotes from two lectures. And so instead of an alternative science, this in a sense is an anti-science. This is sites of knowledge that it wasn't that they were articulated and lost, but rather that they had never risen to the level of articulation. They reside elsewhere. And the examples I want to give of that are some Hawaiian artists and the way that they represent Hawaiian traditions of relationship to the land and the water through photography and art. All right? So there's my encapsulated Foucault. Now I'm going to equally encapsulate Rancière. From Rancière, we take seriously the notion of investigating an aesthetic dimension to politics. What Rancière calls the distribution of the sensible. And this is a quote from him. This is from the aesthetics, politics of aesthetics. The system of divisions and boundaries that define what is visible and audible within a particular aesthetico-political regime. So the distribution of the sensible is the aesthetic practices that enable forms of visibility. So artistic practices, the specific ways of what he calls doing and making that would go into photography or painting, are particular ways of doing and making that are enabled by an aesthetic regime. Okay, that they become possible because the distribution of the sensible allows us to imagine and to render intelligible those forms of representation. So the aesthetic practices become the preconditions for the artistic practices, and I want to use the photography example to illustrate that. Okay, so the first point from Rancière is this idea of an aesthetics, a political aesthetic that allows us to articulate the distribution of sensibility. Okay, the second is his idea, which is not just Rancière. These are not just these people, right? They're in dialogue with many people. I'm kind of crediting these guys for a moment in a conversation that lots of people are having. It's the idea that resistance needs to abandon the old hunt for the best historical agent and instead look very broadly and generously at possible subjects of politics, that vague concepts like the people, which often fall short when compared to what seem like more scientific notions of the proletariat or women or minorities or the colonized, that if we take Rancière seriously, it really kind of go back to an older anarchist notion that we actually need that vagueness, that we need to talk about the people or the demos, because we don't want to presume ahead of time who the agents of resistance are, but rather look again in that sort of that fashion at the kinds of voices that bubble to the surface. And here I want to use an example of coalitions of Native Hawaiians, environmentalists, feminists, scholars, and teachers, and even occasionally, hard as it is to believe, occasionally elements from the Democratic Party and unions who make coalitions around partial shared agendas. And they do that in a sense by moving away from the very identity politics that I used in order to name them, right? Hawaiians or feminists, whatever, to move away from identity politics and instead of asking who are we, asking what can we do. Okay, so it's a more Arendtian. I could have easily picked Hannah Arendt to talk about this too, because I think she's also a good source of these things. All right, so that's my second point, no single historical agent, but rather a wide, a flexible notion of agency. And then the third and final point I want to take from Rancière is the idea that resistance is about nurturing horizontal relationships, that verticality is their way, and that, that we need to think in terms of horizontal distributions, in terms of combinations between systems of possibilities, and to resist the very familiar notion that the way you analyze something is to distinguish between the surface and the depth, so that you can peel away the surface and examine the depth. And that's a very tempting thing, and we use it all the time in daily conversation. We distinguish appearance from reality. We say, you know, this is on the surface, but this is at the heart. We talk that way a lot, but I think Rancière and Foucault and Deleuze and Butler and others are suggesting to us that we be suspicious of that language of surface and depth, because what you have to assume in order to employ this hermeneutic of suspicion, where you peel away the surface to find the underlying reality, is itself a gesture of power. And that a more fruitful resistance would be in stepping away from that temptation to master the depth by eliminating the surface, and instead talk about relations among surfaces. Deleuze uses the language of rhizomes to talk about these kinds of horizontal networks. All right, so that's my encapsulation of some pretty complex ideas in a pretty quick way. Now let me talk a little bit about these examples from Hawaii. The military is a very interesting opponent in the sense that they are so good at monoplasia. They are so highly skilled at telling a single story and collapsing every element of every aspect of anything out there into the one true story. So that the monoglossia of the military is something that, in order to make our way into it, we put it up against, we try to create friction with the heteroglossia of the kinds of coalitions of people that I've been naming here. So one way you have to, again, go back to that first point about the particularity of resistance. Resistance isn't something that happens in general. It happens someplace, it happens sometime, it happens in some context. That when we look at the military, they have to spend a certain amount of time describing the landscape of Hawaii, because we have this thing called EIS, Environmental Impact Statements, and they have to do them periodically or go to court over not doing them because it's required by law. And so when you look at how the military describes the landscape and how the Hawaiians articulate the landscape,